The city buzzed with life, cars honking, people hurrying past, oblivious to each other. Amid the chaos walked a man whose clothes had seen better days, and shoes so worn that the soles threatened to give way with every step. Passers-by cast glances, some sneering, some whispering, their eyes sharp with judgment. "Look at those shoes," a street vendor muttered, barely hiding a smirk. A coworker laughed as he passed, shaking his head. Yet despite the whispers, the stares, and the quiet ridicule, the man walked with a quiet dignity, his shoulders squared, his head held high. Pride and resilience clung to him like armor. Little did anyone know, those worn shoes carried a secret, a story of value and significance that no one on the crowded street could ever have imagined. And soon, that secret would change everything. The man's mornings began before the city fully stirred. In a cramped apartment stacked with worn furniture and peeling wallpaper, he brewed a meager cup of coffee, savoring the warmth as sunlight fought its way through a grimy window. Outside, the streets teemed with life, children chasing after stray dogs, vendors calling out their wares, taxis honking impatiently. To most, it was ordinary chaos. To him, it was the rhythm of survival. He walked to work, shoes scuffing against uneven pavement. Every step reminded him of the world's judgment. A passerby snickered at a hole in his coat. A well-dressed man glanced down, lips curling in quiet derision. Yet he never let anger take him. Instead, he carried himself with a quiet resilience, as if the world's opinion could not diminish his inner dignity. At the factory, he labored long hours for little pay. Machines roared, supervisors barked orders, and colleagues whispered behind hands, mocking his attire. The breaks offered small escapes, a sip of water, a moment to close his eyes and imagine a life beyond these walls. Dreams flickered in his mind like candlelight, owning a little shop, walking barefoot on a sunny beach, or one day being seen for who he truly was, not the threadbare clothes he wore. Outside, wealth paraded past in shiny cars and tailored suits. Men and women with polished shoes and confident strides barely acknowledged him, some casting quick, judgmental glances. He observed silently, not with envy but with a quiet curiosity about lives that seemed so far removed from his own. He wondered what it would be like to belong in their world, yet he never envied it. His dignity could not be bought. Evenings were no different. Crowded buses, neon signs flickering in rain-slicked streets, the smell of street food mingling with exhaust fumes. The city pressed in on him from every side. Still, he found moments of grace. A child's laughter echoing down an alley, an elderly neighbor offering a small smile, a dog wagging its tail at his passing. These fragments reminded him that beauty and humanity existed even in hardship. But on one particularly ordinary evening, as he stepped over puddles glimmering under lamplight, something unusual caught his eye, a glimpse of a woman walking briskly, elegance radiating from every movement, yet her gaze lingered on him. There was a weight to the look, a recognition that stirred curiosity deep inside him. It was brief, fleeting, and easily dismissed, but it would mark the beginning of a chain of events that neither of them could have foreseen. Little did he know, this passing glance would set the stage for a story where old shoes, silent dignity, and unseen value would collide in ways that would change both their lives forever. High above the city streets, in a penthouse that seemed to touch the clouds, the richest woman in town moved with effortless grace. Crystal chandeliers cast prisms of light across marble floors, their sparkle reflecting in her carefully chosen jewelry. Expensive art lined the walls, canvases signed by masters, sculptures that seemed to breathe life into the room. Every detail, every object spoke of wealth of taste and of a life curated with precision. She was known to all, a philanthropist, a business magnate, and a figure whose name alone could stir headlines. People spoke of her with awe or envy, the power she wielded in boardrooms, the parties that bore her signature, the subtle influence she carried in decisions that shaped the city's future. Yet, for all her prominence, she moved through her world with a calm, measured attentiveness. She noticed the little things that others missed, the slight nervous twitch of an assistant, the neglected detail in a painting, the fleeting expression of someone passing on the street below her balcony. To most, she was untouchable, a figure wrapped in silk and glass, removed from ordinary life. But there was something more, a spark of curiosity that drew her toward stories hidden beneath the surface of appearances. She had a fascination with history, with objects and people whose significance was invisible to the casual observer. An old letter tucked in a drawer, a worn artifact at an auction, or the subtle quality in a pair of shoes, she could see value where others saw only dust and age. It was a rare gift, one that had guided her successes and cultivated her reputation as someone who could uncover hidden worth in any form. That day, from her office overlooking the bustling streets, her attention was drawn downward by movement. People swarmed the sidewalks in the usual ebb and flow of life, heads down, minds elsewhere. Most were invisible to her, just tiny figures, stories she wouldn't pause to notice. But one man caught her eye, not because of anything grand, but because of something small, almost imperceptible. The way he walked, careful but weary, the threadbare clothes he wore, and most striking of all, the shoes. Old, scuffed, unremarkable to anyone else, yet to her eyes they hinted at a story, a history. She leaned forward, curiosity sharpening, and watched as he navigated the crowd, unnoticed, unremarkable. Her mind raced with possibilities. These shoes, they were familiar in a way that made her pulse quicken, not because they were luxurious, but because they carried a legacy. The kind of legacy that told a story of craftsmanship, endurance, and time. She remembered seeing them once before in a collection decades ago at an event that most would never recall. Yet here they were, worn and modest, walking down a crowded street in the hands of a man who seemed entirely unaware of their significance. Her curiosity became a quiet fascination. Who was this man? What had led him to wear these shoes without pride or pretense in a city full of eyes that only judged appearances? There was something human, something deeply genuine about his presence, a dignity that refused to bend to ridicule. She felt an almost magnetic pull, an internal whisper telling her that this encounter was no mere coincidence. In stark contrast, the city around him glittered with wealth and superficiality. Polished shoes, shiny cars, tailored suits, these were symbols of status that many assumed defined worth. And yet here he was, a man in tattered shoes, moving with quiet strength, completely immune to the invisible barriers that wealth and power erected. The disparity struck her not as a curiosity alone, but as a story waiting to be told, a truth waiting to be uncovered. As she sipped her tea, she reflected on the strange symmetry of life. The world often overlooked its treasures, hiding them in plain sight. And sometimes the most profound moments came not from those who flaunted their success, but from those who bore their struggles with quiet resilience. She made a decision then, almost instinctively. She would remember this man, these shoes, and the life that seemed ordinary yet carried extraordinary potential. Little did she know, this fleeting attention, this moment of recognition from her lofty perch, would soon intertwine her life with his in ways neither could have imagined. What began as mere curiosity would grow into a chain of events that would challenge perceptions, upend assumptions, and reveal truths about value, dignity, and human connection. For now, she simply watched, her eyes tracing his movements through the crowd. The city roared around them, indifferent, but she was aware, acutely aware, that sometimes the smallest details held the keys to the greatest stories. And somewhere beneath the scuffed leather of those old shoes, a story waited to be discovered. The sun dipped low over the city, casting long shadows across the bustling marketplace. Stalls overflowed with fruits, fabrics, and trinkets, their bright colors a sharp contrast to the gray of the protagonist's worn-out shoes. He navigated carefully through the crowd, carrying a small satchel head down, hoping to pass unnoticed. But the city had no mercy that day. A group of men leaned against a fruit stand, their laughter cutting through the afternoon hum. "Hey, look at those shoes. Are you going to sell them too?" One jeered, pointing with a smirk. Others snickered behind him, some nudging each other to get a better look. Whispers followed like shadows. "Pathetic, how can someone even walk in those?" The man forced a tight-lipped smile, keeping his steps measured. Inside, his heart clenched, memories flashing unbidden. The first time he had felt embarrassed as a child, classmates laughing at his patched shoes. His father's quiet sigh when the soles of his best shoes split on a rainy day. the subtle judgment in every social interaction since. Each chuckle, each pointed glance, added weight to the invisible burden he carried. He reached a quieter corner and paused, hands gripping the straps of his satchel. A small bead of sweat traced his temple, though the day was mild. In that brief stillness, he thought about how much dignity seemed tied to appearances in this world. The irony stung. The very shoes that had served him loyally through years of work, rain, and snow were now the subject of ridicule. How fragile the perception of worth could be, he mused, how quickly people judged without understanding. From across the marketplace, a well-dressed young man leaned casually against a stall, casting another sharp glance at him. "Seriously, how do you even keep those shoes on your feet?" he muttered to his friend, barely hiding a sneer. The protagonist's jaw tightened, but he did not respond. Words might humiliate, but they could not take away the quiet pride he carried inside, a stubborn ember that refused to die. He moved forward, trying to ignore the laughter, the pointing fingers, and the murmurs. Each step was heavy, the worn soles echoing against the cobblestones like the heartbeat of his hidden resilience. And then, almost imperceptibly, someone in the crowd paused. A woman, her posture regal and measured, her eyes sharp and focused. She did not laugh, she did not smirk. She simply watched, and in that silent observation, something changed. Her gaze lingered on the shoes, not with mockery, not with derision, but with a strange recognition. She squinted, leaning slightly forward as if trying to place them. A flicker of understanding crossed her features, curiosity, admiration, a spark that suggested these shoes were no ordinary pair. For a brief moment, the noise of the marketplace fell away. The laughter, the whispers, the pointing fingers, all faded into the background. The protagonist did not notice her, absorbed as he was in the weight of judgment pressing down on him. Yet her attention was enough to foreshadow a shift, a pivot in the story that would soon turn humiliation into revelation. For now, he walked with his head low, shoulders squared despite the sting of ridicule, unaware that among the mocking crowd, a single pair of observant eyes had already seen the truth that everyone else had missed. A child ran past, knocking lightly against his leg, drawing another round of smirks from the onlookers. The man smiled faintly at the child, a gesture of warmth that contrasted sharply with the cruelty surrounding him. Each step, each moment, reinforced his resilience, and though shame lingered like a shadow, so did a spark of hope. Somewhere ahead, change was waiting, hidden in plain sight, waiting for recognition. As he left the marketplace behind, the golden light of dusk catching on the uneven cobblestones, the camera lingers on the subtle glimmer of the shoes, scuffed, worn, yet undeniably significant. The observer in the crowd watches silently, her eyes sharp with understanding, foreshadowing that the story these shoes carried was far from over. High above the marketplace, from the balcony of her penthouse, the richest woman in town watched the ebb and flow of city life below. She often observed the streets from this vantage point, noting patterns, details, and the occasional anomaly that caught her attention. Today, her gaze fell upon a man moving carefully through the crowd, his worn shoes scuffing against the cobblestones with every step. Her eyes narrowed subtly, a slow, deliberate zoom inward, as if reading a story in the movement of leather and thread. There was something familiar about those shoes, not in the way of fashion or wealth, but in the quiet dignity and history they seemed to carry. She had seen shoes like these before, decades ago in a setting few would remember, a collection of rare craftsmanship, a style that had been coveted in its time, now nearly forgotten. The scuffs and cracks weren't signs of neglect. They were marks of endurance, of life fully lived. She leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the marble railing, her mind tracing connections. Could it be? The design, the worn pattern, the subtle stitching, everything aligned with a piece she had once admired, one that had passed through hands of collectors and aristocrats before vanishing into obscurity. It was improbable, almost absurd, to think that such shoes would survive in the chaos of a city street. And yet here they were, carried by a man entirely unaware of their significance. The camera lingers on her face, a soft crease in her brow, lips pressing together in quiet curiosity, eyes alive with recognition. She does not speak, she does not call out. The city roared below, oblivious to this private revelation, but she understood instantly that there was a story hidden in these shoes, one that had endured far longer than the laughter of strangers or the mockery of the unobservant. Meanwhile, the man continued his walk, immersed in his own world, carrying the weight of daily life and unseen judgments. He navigated puddles, avoided a scattering of children, and brushed past street vendors without a glance at the penthouse above. To him, the world was exactly what it seemed: unremarkable, demanding, often cruel. There was no awareness that a pair of observant eyes had singled him out, quietly measuring the value hidden beneath the worn exterior of his shoes. She thought of the stories objects could tell, of how true worth often went unnoticed until someone looked closely enough to see. The scuffed soles, the faded leather, even the faint imprints of past steps, each detail whispered history. Perhaps a journey across continents, perhaps a fleeting encounter with someone extraordinary, perhaps a symbol of endurance in the face of ridicule. She did not yet know the exact story, but instinctively she knew it mattered, and that recognition alone would be the first step toward revealing it. The tension built as she followed his every step, noting the way his posture remained steady despite the jabs of mockery that had already brushed past him. The world ignored him, yet in her eyes, he was remarkable. A single man moving through a crowd, unremarkable to most, yet carrying history in the form of worn leather and enduring pride. For several long moments, the marketplace became a tableau of contrast: laughter and judgment in the foreground, quiet dignity moving forward, and high above, her discerning gaze tracing the invisible thread connecting past and present. Every scuff, every worn seam, told a story that the man could not yet see, and that the world had overlooked entirely. And then, as she sipped her tea, a quiet resolution settled in her chest. She would remember him, these shoes, and this fleeting moment. Patience would be required, for now the man must continue his life unknowing, but the recognition had been made. The story was ready to unfold, and she would be the one to uncover its hidden meaning. Little did he know, each step he took carried him closer to a revelation that would redefine not only his life, but the perception of value, dignity, and recognition itself. The city moved around them, chaotic and indifferent, yet a quiet destiny was already taking shape above the scuffed leather of worn shoes. The next morning, the man made his usual trek through the bustling streets, unaware that the day would mark a turning point. As he paused to tie the fraying laces of his shoes, a soft voice called out from behind him. "Excuse me," said a woman, her tone warm but deliberate. He turned slowly, startled, and found himself face to face with the richest woman in town. Her presence was commanding yet gentle, her tailored coat flowing as if she moved through air itself rather than the crowded street. Jewelry sparkled subtly in the morning light, but it was her eyes, sharp, observant, and kind, that held his attention. He straightened, instinctively defensive. "Can I help you?" he asked, cautious, his voice tinged with embarrassment. He was not used to being approached, much less by someone so evidently wealthy. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said, offering a smile that disarmed suspicion without breaking the rhythm of propriety. "I noticed your shoes yesterday and I couldn't help but ask, may I have a closer look?" He blinked, confused. "My shoes?" His hand instinctively touched the worn leather as if acknowledging their flaws. Pride and shame collided in his chest. "They're just old shoes," he muttered, unsure why someone of her stature would care. "Perhaps," she replied, crouching slightly to examine them, her gaze careful, almost reverent. "Or perhaps they've traveled farther than most people notice. Sometimes the most ordinary things hide extraordinary stories." Her words were gentle but loaded with weight, a bridge between two worlds that seemed impossibly far apart. He hesitated, suspicion mingling with curiosity. There was a pause, a moment where the bustling crowd faded into the background. The city noise, the street vendors, the jeers from strangers, all seemed distant, irrelevant. He watched her, noticing the attention to detail in her gestures, the way she seemed to see more than what was merely visible. "You see," she continued, "there's something about the way these shoes are made, the stitching, the leather, the subtle signs of craftsmanship. They're not common, they have history, and they carry value in ways most people overlook." He swallowed, caught between disbelief and awe. The idea that anyone could see worth in these scuffed shoes was foreign, yet the sincerity in her voice stirred something deep inside him. His posture remained humble, shoulders slightly hunched, but the tension in his chest loosened just enough to feel the warmth of recognition. Why are you telling me this?" he asked softly, still cautious but intrigued. "Because," she said, standing and brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear, "sometimes the world is too quick to judge what it doesn't understand, and sometimes it takes just one person to notice the truth." Her smile was quiet, encouraging, and for the first time in a long while he felt seen not for his poverty, not for his old shoes, but for the dignity he carried despite them. In that brief interaction, a social gap began to close. The luxurious woman and the humble man stood together in the middle of the street, two lives that would soon intersect in ways neither could yet imagine. And in her eyes, the shoes were no longer worn leather. They were a key to a story about to unfold. They moved together to a quieter corner of the street, away from the bustle but still in view of curious onlookers. The woman knelt slightly, eyes fixed on the worn shoes. Her hands hovered over the leather, careful not to damage a single scuff or crease. "These shoes," she began softly, "are not ordinary. They were made by one of the most renowned designers of the past century. Very few pairs exist today, and they were once worn at an exclusive event, attended by some of the most influential people of that time." The man froze, disbelief etched into every line of his face. I don't understand," he stammered, tracing the familiar cracks in the leather with trembling fingers. "These old shoes, they're worth something." "Yes," she said, her voice gentle, full of warmth. "More than most could imagine, but that's not why I'm telling you. The true value isn't in money, it's in the story they carry, the journey they've survived, and the dignity with which they've been worn." He shook his head slowly, his mind racing. Memories of ridicule, whispers, and laughter collided with this revelation. All those years of feeling invisible, overlooked, mocked for his appearance, and now recognition came from the one person who truly saw them. I never knew," he whispered, almost to himself. "I just wore them because they were all I had." The woman smiled, a quiet reassurance that melted the tension in his chest. "And that is exactly why they mean so much. They were worn not for status, but for life, for endurance. That's what makes them remarkable. That's what made me notice." A small crowd had gathered nearby, drawn by their unusual interaction. People peeked from behind stalls, curious eyes observing the man in tattered clothes and the elegant woman speaking softly to him. Whispers replaced laughter, a subtle shift from judgment to intrigue. For the first time, the social contrast was undeniable. The humble man now carried a quiet dignity that shone brighter than wealth, and the rich woman's empathy amplified it. He lowered his gaze, embarrassment and humility washing over him, but this time mingled with pride. The realization that his struggles, his resilience, and his unnoticed life had value was overwhelming. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, unbidden as the weight of recognition settled on him. He had been seen, truly seen, not for pretense, not for appearances, but for the human story he carried in every worn step. The woman placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. "You see," she said, "true recognition doesn't come from those who laugh or point. It comes from those who notice, who understand, who care enough to see beyond the surface. And today I see you." For a long moment, silence hung between them. The city moved around them, indifferent yet softened by this singular exchange. The crowd, sensing something extraordinary, watched quietly, the jeers replaced with murmurs of astonishment. Some nodded in respect, others whispered about the twist of fate unfolding before their eyes. The man finally lifted his gaze, meeting hers with a mix of awe and gratitude. He understood that life had taken a sudden turn, not because of wealth, but because of empathy, insight, and the courage to recognize hidden worth. The shoes, scuffed and worn, had become symbols of his endurance and dignity, and in the eyes of someone who truly saw them, they were priceless. In that moment, the world felt lighter, more just. Mockery and ridicule faded into memory, replaced by understanding, respect, and the emotional vindication of a life that had quietly persevered. And as they stood together, two worlds converging, it became clear. Sometimes the smallest details, unnoticed by most, hold the power to transform lives completely. The days that followed felt surreal for the man. Where once his presence had been met with whispers and laughter, he now walked with a quiet confidence that drew curious, respectful glances. People in the marketplace who had mocked him paused, some averting their eyes, others offering small, hesitant smiles. Even strangers noticed a subtle change, the way he carried himself, the steady rhythm of his worn shoes hitting the pavement, the calm dignity that seemed to radiate from him. He returned home that evening and stood before the small, cracked mirror in his apartment. For the first time in years, he studied himself not with embarrassment, but with recognition. Every line on his face, every crease in his hands, every scuff on his shoes told a story of perseverance and endurance. Slowly, almost ceremoniously, he polished the shoes, each careful stroke symbolic of his newfound awareness. That these worn leather companions had survived life's trials and carried him through hardship with unacknowledged courage. Word of the unusual encounter with the wealthy woman spread quietly through the city. Some called it coincidence, others whispered about fate. Invitations came, subtle at first, small opportunities for work he hadn't dared to pursue, offers of collaboration, even gestures of acknowledgement from those in power who had once overlooked him. Doors opened not because of his appearance, but because someone had finally seen the worth he carried inside. Yet even as his life shifted externally, the deeper transformation was internal. He walked through familiar streets with a new perspective. The laughter that once stung now felt distant, almost irrelevant. He began to smile more freely, to engage with others without the fear of judgment pressing on his chest. The spark of self-confidence, once buried beneath years of ridicule, had ignited. And with it came hope, quiet but persistent, that life could be more than mere survival. Cinematic moments punctuated this new chapter. He paused to watch rain puddles reflect the glow of streetlights, noticing the beauty in small, overlooked details. Slow-motion shots captured the swing of his arms as he walked through crowds, the renewed rhythm in his step, the subtle tilt of his head, all gestures of dignity reclaimed. He mended his clothes, not for appearance alone, but as an act of self-respect, honoring the resilience that had carried him this far. When the richest woman reappeared, it was not with grandeur or spectacle, but with a quiet acknowledgement of his journey. They spoke briefly, smiles exchanged, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Recognition and empathy mattered more than material wealth. She had opened the door, but he had walked through it with his own strength, embracing both the acknowledgement and the dignity that had always belonged to him. Even those who had once ridiculed him began to notice. Conversations shifted, gestures of respect replaced whispers of mockery. It was as if the city itself had adjusted, acknowledging that value was not defined by appearances, but by resilience, courage, and integrity. The shoes, once a source of shame, now symbolized endurance, perseverance, and the quiet heroism of everyday life. He began to help others in subtle ways, a small act of kindness for a struggling vendor, guidance for a young apprentice, a smile to a child who reminded him of his own past. These acts reflected a transformation that went beyond status or recognition. They spoke of empathy, humility, and the understanding that dignity was earned in how one treated oneself and others, not in the approval of the crowd. By the end of this chapter, the man had been transformed, but the true redemption lay not in wealth, opportunity, or public acknowledgement. It lay in the reclamation of self-respect, in the recognition of intrinsic worth, and in the understanding that human dignity, once acknowledged, can illuminate even the darkest corners of a life long overshadowed by ridicule. Material change was merely a reflection. The heart, strengthened and seen, was the true reward. The city's rhythm had shifted in subtle ways, though most people went about their days unaware. For the protagonist, the world no longer felt harsh or mocking. It felt alive with possibility, infused with quiet meaning that had always existed but had gone unnoticed. As he walked through familiar streets, he observed things differently. A child struggling to carry a bundle of books, a vendor juggling coins while keeping an eye on customers, an elderly woman hesitating at a crosswalk. Each moment sparked recognition of the shared human experience he had long overlooked in his own rush to survive. One morning he paused to help the child pick up a spilled stack of books. The boy's eyes widened with gratitude, a simple thank you trembling on his lips. The man smiled softly, feeling a warm swell of understanding. In that small act, he saw the reflection of all the kindness he had longed for, the respect he had once been denied, now flowing through his own hands. These moments became a quiet ritual, an acknowledgement that dignity and humanity were not abstract ideals, but lived experiences, found in the attention given to others. The richest woman watched from her vantage point once more, not to observe him as a curiosity, but to see the ripple of influence that recognition could create. She noticed the gentle way he guided a struggling vendor, the patience with which he helped an elderly neighbor across the street, the respectful nods he offered to passers-by. In each gesture, she saw that true transformation was not defined by wealth or opportunity, but by empathy, humility, and the conscious decision to notice what others ignored. As the city moved around them, voiceover narration captured the protagonist's internal reflection. For years, I believed worth was measured by appearances, by shoes, by clothes, by the opinions of others. I carried shame like a shadow, thinking that the world's judgment defined me. But today, I see differently. True value lies in how we treat others, how we hold ourselves, and how we recognize the dignity that exists in every life, even those overlooked. Cinematic imagery punctuated these reflections. Sunlight glinted off the worn leather of his shoes as he walked, a visual metaphor for endurance. Reflections in puddles mirrored not just his image, but the lives he touched with small acts of kindness. Slow-motion shots captured the subtle shifts in posture, the confident yet humble stride, and the way he moved through spaces once filled with judgment with newfound ease. Even the mundane, a shared smile, a helping hand, a simple nod of acknowledgement took on a weight of meaning, turning ordinary moments into acts of quiet heroism. He began to understand the profound simplicity of human connection. People he had once ignored or assumed would never notice him now engaged with respect, not because of the shoes he wore or the recognition he had received, but because his actions reflected dignity, patience, and empathy. And in giving attention to others, he discovered a kind of freedom he had never known. Freedom from shame, freedom from judgment, and freedom from the invisible chains of insecurity. The richest woman observed quietly, her own heart warmed by the unfolding scenes. Recognition, she realized, was only the beginning. Its power lay in the ripple effect, how seeing someone's worth inspired them to act with humanity in return. Every small kindness the man extended became a testament to the enduring value of dignity, a message to the world that attention, empathy, and care could bridge divides far greater than wealth or status ever could. In private moments, he reflected on his past hardships, the sneers, the whispered ridicule, the times he had felt invisible. Yet each memory now served a different purpose. They were reminders not of shame, but of resilience. Each hardship had forged the ability to notice, to empathize, and to act with compassion. His life had transformed not because of external validation alone, but because recognition had awakened the inherent dignity he had always carried. The city itself seemed to mirror this evolution. Strangers began to exchange glances of quiet respect. People held doors, offered smiles, and paused to acknowledge one another. Humility, kindness, and empathy had become contagious, quietly reshaping the world around him. And as the protagonist moved through this transformed environment, his reflections crystallized into a universal truth. True worth is not measured by appearances, wealth, or power. It is measured by recognition, respect, and the humanity we extend to others. It is found in noticing the overlooked, honoring dignity in the everyday, and choosing to act with compassion even when the world does not watch. As the sun dipped low, casting golden light over the streets, he paused at a puddle and watched his reflection merge with the city around him. The shoes, once scorned, now gleamed with quiet symbolism, not for their material value, but for the journey they had carried, the dignity they had preserved, and the lives they had touched along the way. In that quiet moment, he understood fully that recognition and empathy were not privileges reserved for the wealthy or powerful. They were gifts each person could offer, rippling outward in ways that transformed both giver and receiver. And in that understanding, he walked forward, not as a man defined by mockery, but as a man defined by the enduring power of human connection. The city glowed in the soft warmth of late afternoon, streets alive with the rhythm of everyday life. The man walked steadily, each step purposeful, each stride filled with quiet dignity. His worn shoes, now polished and carefully cared for, carried him forward not just across cobblestones, but into a life transformed by recognition, resilience, and empathy. The richest woman watched from a distance, her subtle smile acknowledging the journey she had quietly witnessed. She had not changed him, she had merely seen him. And in being seen, he had found what the world had long overlooked: his inherent worth, his courage, and the dignity that had never belonged to the shoes, but to him. Voiceover narration reflects the story's universal truth. Sometimes what the world overlooks holds the greatest value. True wealth is not in shoes, money, or appearances, but in kindness, empathy, and the courage to see the unseen. Every person carries a story, every life holds dignity, and often the smallest acts of recognition create ripples that change worlds, quietly, profoundly, irrevocably. He paused for a moment at a sunlit corner, observing children laughing, vendors nodding in respect, and strangers exchanging gentle smiles. In those simple interactions, he saw a reflection of his own journey, from ridicule to recognition, from invisibility to quiet influence, from shame to pride. The streets that once echoed with judgment now mirrored his restored humanity. Slow motion captures him walking confidently, sunlight glinting off his polished shoes, casting long, golden shadows. In the background, the richest woman stands, watching with serene satisfaction, a subtle acknowledgement that true wealth lies not in material opulence, but in the recognition of human dignity. The camera lingers on this cinematic tableau. Man and city in harmony, resilience and empathy intertwined. A quiet reminder to viewers that noticing the overlooked, valuing small acts of kindness, and honoring humanity can transform lives. Look around you, the narration concludes softly. See those who are often ignored, recognize the unseen, and in doing so, discover that the greatest wealth lies not in possessions, but in the courage to honor the humanity in every life. As the scene fades, sunlight bathes the city in warmth, leaving the lasting image of hope, dignity, and the quiet triumph of recognition. A story of humanity restored, one step at a time.